Hi, and welcome back to ELA Tuesday for 3rd through 6th grade. I'm Sherry Easton, and we're going to turn today to the book Terrible Things. This time, when we look at character interactions, we're going to look at an interaction between one character and a whole bunch of characters together that operate like one. This is Terrible Things. Remember, we're looking at character interactions. In Europe, during World War II, many people looked the other way when terrible things happened. They pretended not to know that their neighbors were being taken away and locked in concentration camps. They pretended not to hear their cries for help. The Nazis killed millions of Jews and others in the Holocaust. If everyone had stood together at the first sign of evil, would this have happened? Standing up for what you know is right is not always easy, especially if the one you face is bigger and stronger than you. It's easy to look the other way, but if you do, then terrible things can happen. Now we're going to look at what happens when Little Rabbit, there he is right there, meets the terrible things. Remember, the terrible things are a whole bunch of creatures that operate like one character together. Everything they do is always right together, so they actually end up being like one character. The clearing in the woods was home to the small forest animals. The birds and squirrels shared the trees, and the rabbits and porcupines shared the shade beneath the trees, and the frogs and fish shared the cool brown waters of the forest pond. They were content until the day that the terrible things came. Little Rabbit saw their terrible shadows before he saw them. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, and their shadows blotted out the sun and darkened everything. See how scared he is? Notice this first interaction, right? Here's the terrible things, and Little Rabbit is full of fear. It's the first interaction. Not all character interactions are pleasant, right? We have come for every creature that with feathers on its back, the terrible things thundered. We don't have feathers, the frogs said. Nor we, said the squirrels. No, definitely not, said the porcupines. Not us, said the rabbits. The little fish leaped from the water to show the shine of their scales, but the birds twittered nervously in the tops of the trees. Feathers. They rose in the air, then screamed away into the blue of the sky. But the terrible things had brought their terrible nets, and they flung them high and caught the birds and carried them away. The other forest creatures talked nervously among themselves. Those birds were always kind of noisy, old Porcupine said. Good riddance, I say. There's more room in the trees now, the squirrel said. Why did the terrible things want the birds? Little Rabbit asked. What's wrong with feathers? Ooh, no, we mustn't ask, Big Rabbit said. The terrible things don't need a reason. Just be glad it wasn't us that they wanted. Notice that Little Rabbit has an interaction with the terrible things, even though they're not around. He has that when he says, why did the terrible things want the birds? Little Rabbit asked. What's wrong with feathers? See, he's questioning the terrible things. That's an interaction, even though they're not even here, right? Now there were no birds to sing in the clearing, but life went on almost as before, until the day that the terrible things came back. Little Rabbit heard the thump of their terrible feet before they came into sight. We have come for every bushy-tailed creature who lives in the clearing, the terrible things thundered. We have no tails, the frog said. Nor do we, not real tails, the porcupine said. The little fish leaped from the water to show the smooth shine of their finned tails, and the rabbits turned their rumps so the terrible things could see for themselves that they had little fluffy ball tails, not bushy-tailed. Our tails are round and furry, they said, and by no means are they bushy. The squirrels chittered their fear and ran high into the treetops. But the terrible things swung their terrible nets higher than the squirrels could run and wider than the squirrels could leap, and they caught them all, and they carried them away out of the forest clearing. Those squirrels were greedy, Big Rabbit said, always storing away things for themselves and never sharing. But why did the terrible things take them away? Little Rabbit asked. Do the terrible things want the clearing for themselves? No, they have their own place, Big Rabbit said. But the terrible things don't need a reason. Just mind your own business, Little Rabbit. We don't want them to get mad at us. Now there were no birds to sing or squirrels to chitter in the trees. But life in the clearing went on almost as before, until the day the terrible things came back again. Notice they come back every time, right? Little Rabbit heard the rumble of their terrible voices. We have come for every creature that swims in the waters, the terrible things thundered. Oh, we can't swim, the rabbit said quickly. And we can't swim, the porcupine said. The frogs dived deep in the forest pool, with ripples spiraled like corkscrews on the dark brown water, and the little fish darted this way and that in streaks of silver. But the terrible things threw their terrible nets down into the depths, and they dragged up the dripping frogs and the shimmering fish, and they carried them away. Now, following the pattern of the book, we know what Little Rabbit's interaction is going to be, right? He's going to question the terrible things. Why did the terrible things take them? What did the frogs and the fish do to them? Little Rabbit asked. Probably nothing, Big Rabbit said. But the terrible things don't need a reason. Many creatures dislike frogs, lumpy, slimy things they are. And fish are so cold and unfriendly, they never talk to any of us. Now there were no birds to sing, no squirrels to chitter, no frogs to croak, no fish to play in the forest pool. A nervous silence filled the clearing. But life went on almost as usual, until the day the terrible things came back. Little Rabbit smelled their terrible smell before they came into sight. The rabbits and the porcupines looked everywhere except at each other. Think about why they're not looking at each other. There's an interaction, right? So why are the porcupines and the rabbits not looking at each other? I think it's because they're both expecting that the terrible things have come for one of them, right? We have come for every creature that sprouts quills on its back, the terrible things thundered. The rabbits stopped quivering. We don't have quills, they said, whew, fluffing their soft white fur. So they're relieved, because they're not coming from the rabbits, they're coming from the porcupines. The porcupines bristled with all their strength, but the terrible things covered them with the curl of their terrible nets, and the porcupines hung in them like flies in a spider's web as the terrible things carried them away from the forest clearing. Those porcupines always were bad-tempered, Big Rabbit said shakily. Prickly, stickly things. This time, Little Rabbit didn't ask why. Because he knew the terrible things didn't need a reason. The smell still filled the clearing, though the terrible things had gone. Notice that interaction. I'm going to read that one more time, because this time, Little Rabbit's interaction is to ignore the terrible things, right? He's kind of given up. He says this time, Little Rabbit didn't even ask why. By now, he knew that the terrible things didn't need a reason. I liked it better when there were all kinds of creatures in our clearing, he said, and I think we should move. What if the terrible things come back? So now, the interaction is that he's worried about the terrible things, right? I liked it better. Nonsense, Big Rabbit said. Why should we move? This has always been our home, and the terrible things won't come back. The only ones left are us. We are the rabbits, and it can't happen to us. As day followed peaceful day, Little Rabbit thought Big Rabbit must be right. Maybe they weren't coming back. He started to feel a little bit more comfortable. Until the day the terrible things came back. Little Rabbit saw the terrible gleam of their terrible eyes through the dark forest, and he smelled again their terrible smell. We have come for any creature that is white, the terrible things thundered. There are no white creatures here but us, Big Rabbit said. We have come for you then, the terrible things said. The rabbits scampered in every direction. Help, they screamed. Somebody help! But there was no one left to help. No fish, no birds, no squirrels, no frogs, no porcupines. Nobody left to help. And the big circling nets dropped over them, and the terrible things carried them away out of the forest clearing. So now Little Rabbit has a pretty horrible interaction with the terrible things, right? In this case, the terrible things caught the rabbits and took them away. But notice who's still here. Little Rabbit somehow got away. So let's see if he's going to interact with the terrible things again. All but Little Rabbit, who was little enough to hide in a pile of rocks by the pond and smart enough to stay so still and so quiet that the terrible things thought he was a rock himself. When they had all gone, Little Rabbit crept into the middle of the empty clearing. I should have tried to help the other rabbits, he thought. If only we creatures had stuck together. It could have been different. Sadly, Little Rabbit left the forest clearing. He'd go tell other forest creatures about the terrible things, and he hoped somebody would listen. So in this story, the one character, Little Rabbit, interacts with a bunch of characters, the terrible things, right? And sometimes his interactions aren't even directly with the terrible things. Sometimes he interacts about them, right? When he questions them or hides from them or is scared by them. That's an interaction. It's a reaction to the terrible things that Little Rabbit has. Let's look back at some of those moments. You can see here, Little Rabbit is already interacting. He's just seen the terrible things. He hasn't even heard them speak yet, right? But he's already interacting with fear. He's responding to them with fear. Let's find another moment. It's when he's asking Big Rabbit. Remember this moment when he's asking Big Rabbit, why did they come for the birds? I don't understand. Right? So he's questioning the actions of the terrible things. And Big Rabbit says, don't worry about it. It's perfectly fine. It just happens. Right? So Little Rabbit is afraid of them. He's interacting. He's responding to the actions of the terrible things without actually talking to them. Here's another action. Here's another time when he's responding, when Big Rabbit says, don't worry about it. It's going to be perfectly fine. And Little Rabbit's not so sure. You can tell by his face. He's not so sure. He doesn't believe that it's all going to be fine, right? He misses the birds and the squirrels at that moment. Look at this picture. Here's another time when Little Rabbit interacted with the terrible things. Notice how he's cowering, kind of in fear, like he's shrinking away, right? Because he's so afraid of them. This is when he saw the terrible gleam of their terrible eyes through the forest darkness, right? So you can tell already that he's responding to those terrible things. And then at the end, when he hides, right? That's another interaction because he's hiding from them, from the inner. So not only every interaction has to be direct, right? Sometimes you have an indirect interaction where you're responding to a character without actually responding directly to them. And then when Little Rabbit leaves the forest to go off and warn the other forest creatures about the terrible things, that's also an interaction because he's responding to what the terrible things did, right? So now he's saying, I'm going to go and save the other forest creatures, right? That is The Terrible Things by Eve Bunting.